Morning, everyone. We're going to be going through the remaining amendments to the Constitution, 11 through 27. So this will be our last portion of the amendments. All right. So the 11th Amendment is the first one that was added prior to the end of George Washington's administration. It's lawsuits against states, and what this one basically says is citizens from another state or a foreign country can't sue states in federal court. This was a way to maintain a level of federalism, and it was also the only amendment to be added to limit the judicial branch. There's no other qualifications or limitations upon the Supreme Court. And so if you want to go ahead and sue a state, you have to do it in a state court, not in the federal court system. All right, so the 12th Amendment is the changes to the second article involving the election of the president and the vice president. This largely has to do with the election of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So this amendment was adopted to clarify some of those problems. So previous to this, there was only one ballot used, and so you would just write one name on it, and the person who got the most votes in the Electoral College was the president, and the runner-up was the vice president. So if you could imagine in our current political situation, Donald Trump would be the president, and Hillary Clinton would be the vice president. And that doesn't make for a very stable political position within the executive branch. So, as a result of this amendment, electors meet in their own states and use separate ballots now for the president and for the vice president. So, you vote for the president on one, and then the vice president is listed on the other, but they are paired together. If there's not a candidate with a majority of the Electoral College, if someone doesn't have 270 electoral votes, then the top three candidates go to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives then has a vote. And each state has one vote, and 2/3 of the states must vote in order for the House of Representatives to pick the president. This has happened a couple times. The same kind of thing happens for the vice president. So the president goes to the House, so then the vice president then would go to the Senate, and they go through a similar procedure, one state, one vote, and 2/3 have to be present. After that, it's a long drop off. It's quite some time before we have an amendment to the Constitution, and this is where we have the 13th Amendment introduced in 1865 at the end of the American Civil War. And so this is the first of three amendments that deal with the ending of the Civil War, and this one deals with the abolition of slavery. So no more slavery in the United States as a result of the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is probably the most important amendment to come out of these Reconstruction or post-Civil War amendments. This was 1868, and these are basically civil rights. And most people know that the 14th Amendment is about birthright citizenship. It gets cited quite a bit in today's argument about illegal immigration, whether or not people can come into the United States and then have a child. That child becomes an American citizen. Well, do you deport the parents? Do you send the child with them? You can't deport an American citizen. So this has really created some complex problems when we talk about immigration issues in the U.S. So anyone born or naturalized in the U.S. is both a citizen of the United States and the state in which they live. This allowed for former slaves to become full citizens, both male and female. And no state can pass laws that deprive citizens of their civil rights or due process. Well, the American South kind of said, hey, watch this. And that's why we had Jim Crow laws and eventually the Civil Rights Act of 1968 by Lyndon B. Johnson. So to try and keep some of these things in play. The 14th Amendment does eliminate one of the most evil portions of the Constitution, and that was the Three-Fifths Compromise. The 15th Amendment is the last of the Civil War amendments or the Reconstruction amendments, and this deals with the right to vote according to race. So before this amendment, states decided who could vote. The federal government acted to protect the right to vote, and so what we get here is the right for black males to vote in federal elections. Some states tried to pass laws that said they could vote in federal elections, but they couldn't vote in state elections or local elections, things along those lines. Literacy tests, property ownership tests were all put out. Poll taxes, all these things were tried to eliminate people from having the ability to vote based on race. So this allowed the Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has been weakened as of late. There's been some issues where the Supreme Court has declared certain actions of the Voting Rights Act to be unconstitutional. All right, the 16th Amendment. Oh, my favorite, the Income Tax Amendment, passed under the Woodrow Wilson administration. I'll reserve comment. In 1894, under William McKinley, an income tax had been passed to fund the Spanish-American War, and the Supreme Court found it unconstitutional. This amendment made it possible to have an income tax where the government just gets to take away taxes from your money because the government says they can. Lincoln tried to do this during the Civil War, and it was found unconstitutional as well. And so the way you take something that's unconstitutional and make it constitutional is you put it in the Constitution, and that's where the 16th Amendment is. Ugh. All right, 17th Amendment. Another amendment I hate under Woodrow Wilson's administration. Article 1, Section 3 said that senators were to be chosen by state legislatures. So, for example, then the men and women who were up in Springfield at the state capitol would pick our 2 senators. Today, now the people elect the senators. So Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth are voted for by the people of Illinois rather than our state legislators, which I think means that they only represent certain aspects like Chicago, because then they don't have to campaign across the whole state and win state favor. This also means that senators now are voted in popular elections, and so they represent people's interests rather than state interests, and I think it weakens federalism because it takes away power from the state. Woodrow Wilson. The 18th Amendment. Hey, it's the prohibition of intoxicating liquors. So this movement started in the 1800s, and it was called the Temperance Movement. You guys might remember Carrie Nation from your U.S. history, where she took an axe around and she started busting up saloons and bars and barrels and kegs and stuff. So following World War I, people were looking for a way to be more, pure, more pure of heart, more moral, and so it's like alcohol was part of the problem. So let's get rid of alcohol, and people will become, as white as doves. That didn't help. Because when this thing passed, they passed a law once it became constitutional called the Volstead Act. And the Volstead Act was the enforcement arm of it, and it was impossible to enforce it, and probably just made organized crime even more powerful as far as being underground, and then having incredible political pressure. This amendment was repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment. This is a great example of why we shouldn't use the Constitution to react to societal changes. We don't need to have, this is a snapshot in American history. We don't need to have this, the Constitution as a tool to try and affect society with social norms. The 19th Amendment. Women's right to vote was passed in 1920. This is called women's suffrage, and it was a movement that had started in the states and territories very early on. Wyoming was the first territory to pass the suffrage for women as a voting tool. That's why they're called the Equality State, and that was in 1876. Other states had allowed women to vote in local and state elections, but not federal elections. But the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in all levels of elections. Federal courts basically ruled that the Constitution said it doesn't say women, so therefore they don't have the right to vote. And that was a very close-minded viewing of the Constitution, not intended, I don't think, by the framers. Women's suffrage had tried to get the federal vote every year since 1878, and they finally did it upon the success of it being passed in 1920. The 20th Amendment, the limitation of congressional and presidential terms. All right, so this is often called the lame duck amendment, and this deals with whenever the president was elected by the Electoral College in December, he would wait until March 20th before inauguration. And that's because the fastest way to get around in the country at the time when the Constitution was ratified was by horseback. Well, by 1933, we had stuff like trains and airplanes and stuff that could move people around. So the idea was, hey, let's go ahead and change the date on which the president is inaugurated, and that it was changed from March 20th to January 20th of the year following the election. So it's the reason why it was called a lame duck amendment was it said that a president between election day and inauguration day, if he wasn't returning to office, was as useful as a lame duck. A duck that doesn't have legs that work, so it just I guess kind of sits there. This does say that also if the president dies in the period between the Electoral College and inauguration, the vice president elect replaces the president elect as the president of the United States, just kind of a stopgap measure. 21st Amendment, the repeal of prohibition. Federal prohibition of alcohol ends. States could choose to ban alcohol, and in some places, counties as parts of states. Parts of Maine remained alcohol-free for quite some time, and in our communities, maybe a county's not dry in Illinois, but maybe a town is. Compare Medora to Brighton and Shipman now, where Medora still can't sell beer within city limits, but Brighton and Shipman can sell packaged liquor, or in Brighton's case, they have a bar or two. I can't remember how many, but this was a way to bring alcohol back into legal usage. 22nd Amendment, the limitation on presidential terms, the limiting of a president to 2 terms as a result of Franklin Delano Roosevelt being elected to 4 terms. Even though he didn't finish out his 4th term due to his death, I mean, Truman finished it, but he was elected 4 times because this angered Republicans because it had broken the presidential precedent set by George Washington of only serving 2 terms. But Roosevelt was adamant about being president because you shouldn't have to. The idea was you shouldn't have to change horses in midstream because we didn't want to have a change in the presidential office during World War II. It did happen anyway, but it was a short period of time that Truman served after Roosevelt's death before the end of the war. So the president is limited to 2 terms with a maximum of 10 years in office, and we talked about this in class quite a bit earlier. If a president is serving a term and he dies, and there is 2 years or less left on his term, the vice president serves out the remaining 2 years and can run for 2 full terms of his own or her own, and then can have 10 years total. So you guys remember we talked about that quite a bit. That's the bullet point right there. All right, 23rd Amendment. This allowed for the people who lived in the District of Columbia to vote for President of the United States. So because the District of Columbia is not a state, they weren't allowed to send electors to the Electoral College to pick the president. And so in 1963, the people of District of Columbia are like, hey, we finally need to have representation and a vote. And so they received it under the 23rd Amendment. So they get the same number of electors as the smallest and least populous state, which is Wyoming, and you get 3. So you get 2 for each member of the Senate and 1 for a member of the House, because everyone's guaranteed at least 1 member of the House and everyone's guaranteed 2 members of the Senate. 24th Amendment, poll taxes. Some southern states had used poll taxes under Jim Crow South legislation, and poor Americans, African Americans, and white Americans weren't allowed to vote because they didn't own property, they couldn't show pay stubs or things like that, or they had to just out and out pay full tax in order to vote. And so the poll tax was eliminated in the 24th Amendment. 25th Amendment. This is the Presidential Disability and Succession Amendment. Those of you that are fans of the television show Designated Survivor with Kiefer Sutherland may be familiar with this. Article 2 left as a question if the president, if he died, if the vice president was actually the president or only acts in his place. John Tyler settled that whenever William Henry Harrison passed away in office. Tyler just said, I'm the president, and everybody's like, oh, okay. And there was no acting about it, but in the language of the Constitution, it did need to be changed. So what happens was the vice president became president, but the vice president's office remained vacant. So they need to find a way to fill this out. And so the vice president becomes president. Then as president, he now appoints his vice president. The Senate approves that appointment, and they move on. This also deals with when the president has to if he becomes incapacitated or disabled. When Ronald Reagan was shot in an attempted assassination attempt, he had to go under anesthetic, and so George H.W. Bush became president-ish for about 6 hours or so while Ronald Reagan was in surgery. Um, it's just a way to handle those kind of situations, especially in the nuclear age when a lot can happen in a short amount of time. The 26th Amendment is the voting rights for 18-year-olds. This largely came about as a result of the Vietnam War, where, hey, kids are 18 and going off to fight in Vietnam, but yet they don't have the ability to vote in the United States. And so Congress, through the efforts of young people and political action, granted 18-year-olds the right to vote through the establishment of this constitutional amendment. And so the amendment changed the voting age, and so it's 18 across the country in federal elections. And finally, the 27th Amendment. This is a restraint on congressional salaries, and this was passed in 1992 when I was in college. And this was the one I told you about. This was originally one of the Bill of Rights, one of the 12 that Madison had proposed, but this one did not make it. It passed in 1992 as a result of a University of Texas law student convincing the Michigan General Assembly to ratify this amendment, making it the 27th Amendment. So for his senior project, I guess it wasn't a senior project, it was for his law degree, this project changed the Constitution. And so you can't give yourself a raise while you're in session. So Congress votes itself a raise. It can't take place until there's another election. So the new members of Congress get the raise, or the ones that get reelected, not the ones who were in office when the raise was put into place. Okay, that's all 27 amendments to the Constitution in these two presentations. There's an assignment that accompanies this. It's very brief, and if you need anything, give me a holler, and take care. We'll see you a bit.